The echoes of an unknown past. Marcus Davidson stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Newport Beach villa, absently swirling a glass of 30-year-old scotch. The golden liquid caught the last remnants of the setting sun, casting rippling reflections across the glossy marble floor. Outside, the Pacific waves rolled onto the private shore, their rhythmic crashes once a source of comfort, now just background noise in a life filled with possessions, but devoid of true connection. The sky, painted in brilliant hues of orange and pink, should have been mesmerizing. 15 years ago, Marcus might have stood in awe, marveling at the sheer beauty of the world. But today, like everything else in his empire, it was just another thing he owned but could no longer appreciate. His phone buzzed on the sleek, black marble counter beside him. He ignored it. It was always business, mergers, acquisitions, stock market fluctuations. The endless cycle of corporate dominance no longer excited him the way it once did. What was left after you had conquered everything? A deep sigh escaped his lips as he turned from the window, walking toward his leather chair. He had built this life from nothing. From a struggling young entrepreneur to one of the wealthiest CEOs in the world, his name was synonymous with power and success. People feared him, respected him, but no one truly knew him. As he settled into his chair, a gentle knock on the villa's massive oak doors broke through the silence. He frowned. No one visited unannounced. His staff was meticulous about scheduling. A surge of irritation flared, but curiosity overtook it. His butler, an elderly man named Vincent, appeared at the entrance to his study. "Sir, there are two young gentlemen at the door. They insist they need to speak with you immediately." Marcus arched an eyebrow. "Business." Vincent hesitated, something unusual for the normally composed man. "No, sir. They claim to be your sons." The words hung in the air like an unforgiving winter chill. Marcus sat motionless, his fingers tightening around the glass. His sons. Impossible. He had never married. He had never fathered a child. At least, not to his knowledge. He placed the scotch on the table, standing slowly. "Send them in." Vincent nodded and disappeared. A strange, almost eerie quiet settled in as Marcus awaited their arrival. His mind raced, digging through past relationships. There had been many women, brief entanglements, nothing lasting. None had ever come to him with a child, let alone two. The soft sound of footsteps echoed through the marble-floored corridor. Then, they stood before him. Two boys. No, young men, dressed in sharp navy blue suits. They looked to be around 17 or 18, their golden brown hair neatly styled. But what struck Marcus most was their eyes. His eyes. The same piercing shade of blue that had stared back at him in the mirror for decades. The taller of the two cleared his throat. "Mr. Davidson, we need to talk." Marcus folded his arms, forcing himself to remain calm despite the storm of emotions threatening to rise. "I don't know who you are, but you're clearly mistaken." The younger one stepped forward, holding up a faded photograph. "This is our mother," he said, voice steady but laced with emotion. "And that's you. 20 years ago." Marcus felt his breath hitch as his gaze fell upon the picture. It was unmistakably him, standing beside a woman with fiery auburn hair and a radiant smile. His chest tightened. He knew that face. Her name was Evelyn, a woman he had loved, if only briefly, in the chaos of his younger years. A woman he had walked away from, convinced that love was a distraction from the empires he was destined to build. His pulse quickened. If what these boys were saying was true, he had abandoned more than just a fleeting romance. He had left behind a family. Swallowing the lump in his throat, he met their gaze. "Tell me everything." Shadows of the past, whispers of the truth. Marcus Davidson had built his entire life on control. Of his company, his wealth, his destiny. But as he sat across from the two young men claiming to be his sons, that control felt like sand slipping through his fingers. The air in his opulent villa was thick with tension. the weight of an unspoken past pressing down on all of them. The taller of the two, the one with a sharper jawline and an unmistakable glint of determination in his icy blue eyes, cleared his throat. "My name is Adrian," he said firmly. "And this is my brother, Caleb." Marcus studied them, searching for some flaw in their claim, some reason to dismiss them. He had spent years perfecting the ability to detect lies. His empire depended on it. But as he looked at them, he found no deceit, only something even more unsettling. Familiarity. Caleb, the younger one, placed the old photograph on the table between them. The sight of it stirred something in Marcus that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: regret. "She told us about you," Adrian continued. His voice was steady, but his fingers twitched slightly, betraying the emotion beneath his composed exterior. "About how you were once in love, how you left before you knew she was pregnant." Marcus inhaled sharply but said nothing. Caleb leaned forward, his expression a mixture of curiosity and restrained anger. "Did you ever love her?" The question was a dagger to the chest. Marcus had spent decades making ruthless decisions, shutting off emotions in favor of logic. But this was different. He couldn't answer as quickly as he wanted to. He thought back to Evelyn. The way she used to laugh at his ambition, calling him a dreamer with a reckless heart. How she made him feel something deeper than any business deal ever had. But love? That was a dangerous thing. "I cared for her," Marcus admitted after a long pause. "But I was young. I was building something. I thought." He stopped himself, realizing how hollow his excuses sounded, especially now. Adrian's jaw clenched. "You thought she'd be fine without you." "I didn't know," Marcus said defensively. "If I had." Caleb cut him off. "If you had known, would it have changed anything?" Marcus hesitated, and that hesitation was answer enough. Silence settled over the room like a heavy fog. The ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner suddenly seemed deafening. Finally, Adrian spoke again. "She never told you because she knew what you'd choose." His voice was quieter now, but no less powerful. "She knew you'd pick your empire over us." Marcus exhaled slowly, the weight of the truth sinking in. "Where is she now?" The brothers exchanged a glance. It was Caleb who answered, his voice barely above a whisper. "She passed away 2 years ago." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. His fingers tightened around the armrests of his chair, but it did nothing to steady the sudden dizziness that overcame him. He had spent his entire life believing he had left behind nothing but fleeting memories. Now he was being forced to confront the reality that he had abandoned more than just a woman. He had left behind a family. "She was sick," Adrian continued. "Cancer. She fought as long as she could. But in the end," he trailed off, swallowing hard. "In the end, it was just us." Guilt clawed its way up Marcus's throat. Evelyn had been strong, independent. He had convinced himself that she would move on, that she'd find someone better suited for a quiet life. But instead, she had been raising his sons alone, fighting a battle he had never even known about. Caleb leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "We don't want your money," he said abruptly, as if cutting off any assumptions Marcus might have had. "We didn't come here for some inheritance or handouts." Adrian nodded. "We came here because we needed to know." His gaze locked onto Marcus. "We needed to see if you were the man she said you were, or the one we've imagined our whole lives." Marcus felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. He had built himself into a legend in the business world. Ruthless, untouchable, a self-made man. But sitting here, under the scrutinizing eyes of 2 young men who had every right to hate him, he felt small. He glanced back at the photograph. The younger version of himself stared back, full of reckless ambition, blind to what he had left behind. "Why now?" Marcus finally asked, his voice quieter than before. "Why come looking for me after all these years?" Adrian and Caleb exchanged another glance, this one more hesitant. "There's something you need to know," Adrian said, his voice careful now, as if he were treading on dangerous ground. Marcus frowned. "What is it?" Caleb took a deep breath. "She left something behind for you." A strange, uneasy feeling settled in Marcus's gut. "What do you mean?" Adrian reached into the pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope. The edges were slightly worn, as if it had been handled too many times before being delivered. He set it on the table in front of Marcus. "She wrote this before she passed," Adrian said. "She wanted you to have it, but only if we thought you deserved to read it." Marcus's throat went dry. His fingers hovered over the envelope, his pulse quickening. He had spent decades believing that the past was buried, that he had successfully outrun the ghosts of what could have been. But now, those ghosts were staring him in the face, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he was ready to face them. A letter from the past. The envelope lay between Marcus and his sons like an unspoken challenge. The air in the room was heavy, thick with expectation. His fingers hovered over the aged paper, his pulse thrumming in his ears. A letter. From her. It was as if Evelyn had reached through time, pulling him back to a place he had tried so hard to leave behind. He had spent decades outrunning the past, drowning it in ambition, in power, in the relentless pursuit of more. But no empire, no amount of wealth, could shield him from the reckoning that now sat before him. Adrian and Caleb were watching him closely. Neither spoke, but the weight of their gazes burned into his skin. Finally, with a deep, steadying breath, Marcus picked up the envelope. The paper was slightly rough beneath his fingertips, worn from time, and the hands that had carried it before him. He turned it over and saw his name written in Evelyn's elegant handwriting. Delicate yet strong, just like she had been. His throat tightened. Slowly, he slid his finger under the flap, breaking the seal. The sound seemed deafening in the silence. He unfolded the letter, the scent of faded ink and old paper filling his senses, and then he began to read. "Marcus, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and it means that Adrian and Caleb have found you. I always knew they would. They have your determination, your stubbornness, your fire. I debated whether or not to write this letter for a long time. I wasn't sure if you'd even care. I wasn't sure if you deserved to know. But then I thought about the man I once knew, the man who held the world in his hands, but still looked at me like I was the only thing that mattered. I don't know if that man still exists, but if he does, if even a shred of him remains, then I need you to listen. I never told you about them because I knew you. I knew that you were meant for something great. I knew that if I told you, you would have felt obligated to stay. And Marcus, you were never meant to stay. You were meant to build, to conquer, to rise. But I also knew that if you left, you wouldn't come back. And I was right. I raised our sons alone, and I don't regret a second of it. They are strong. They are good. They are everything I could have hoped for and more. But there's one thing they never had. You. I don't know what you'll do now that you know the truth. Maybe you'll walk away again. Maybe you'll convince yourself that it's too late. But if there's one thing I learned in life, it's that time doesn't wait for second chances. You either take them, or you lose them forever. So Marcus, this is your choice. Are you going to walk away again? Or are you finally going to stay? Evelyn. Marcus's hands trembled as he finished reading. He hadn't realized he had been holding his breath until he exhaled, the sound shaky and raw. Adrian and Caleb said nothing, but the tension in the room had shifted. The air felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. Slowly, Marcus folded the letter, setting it back on the table. His fingers lingered on the paper, tracing the edges as if he could somehow touch the past. He had spent years chasing greatness, and in doing so, he had left behind something far greater than success. A family. His family. He looked up, meeting the eyes of the two young men who had come here seeking answers. I don't know how to fix this, Marcus admitted, his voice quieter than he had intended. I don't know if I can fix this. Adrian tilted his head slightly, studying him. We didn't come here for apologies. Caleb nodded. We just needed to know if you cared. Marcus swallowed hard. Did he care? The very fact that his chest ached, that the words on that letter had carved through his carefully built armor, told him everything he needed to know. He had spent years believing he was untouchable. But he wasn't. Not when it came to this. I want to know you, he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. He had spent so much of his life building relationships based on transactions, partnerships, alliances, deals. But this wasn't business. This was real. Adrian and Caleb exchanged another glance. But this time, there was something different in their expressions. Something softer. Hope. I don't expect you to make up for the years you weren't there, Adrian said carefully. But maybe. He hesitated. Maybe we can start with now. Marcus felt something shift inside him. Something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. A chance. Not at redemption, but at something real. I'd like that, he said, his voice steadier this time. For the first time in years, Marcus Davidson, the man who had built an empire, felt like he had finally found something worth fighting for. And this time, he wouldn't walk away. A legacy reclaimed. Marcus sat in the vast silence of his Newport Beach villa, staring at the letter Evelyn had left behind. The weight of her words pressed down on him like an ocean tide, threatening to pull him under. His entire life had been calculated, strategic. Every decision, every move had been made with precision, designed to accumulate power, wealth, and influence. Yet here, in the face of two sons he never knew he had, Marcus found himself standing on the edge of something he had no control over. Family. Across from him, Adrian and Caleb watched in quiet patience. They had been raised without him, had built their own lives without his presence, and yet they had sought him out. Not for his fortune, not for his empire, but for answers. For him. But did he have anything to give them? After a long silence, Marcus finally looked up. His voice, for once, held no authority. Just raw honesty. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. Adrian leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Neither do we. Caleb nodded. We just know we want to. The simplicity of their words hit Marcus harder than he expected. They weren't asking for retribution. They weren't demanding anything. They were just here. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling deeply. Tell me about your mother. Adrian's face softened, a flicker of sadness passing through his sharp features. She was strong. She never spoke ill of you, not once. We always knew you existed, but she never let us resent you. She said you had a different path. Caleb nodded. She never wanted us to grow up thinking we weren't good enough for you. So instead, she raised us to believe we were enough on our own. Marcus swallowed the lump in his throat. He had expected bitterness, anger, but there was none. Only truth. He shifted in his seat. And yet, you still wanted to find me. Adrian gave a small, knowing smile. Because no matter what path you chose, you're still our father. Marcus had negotiated billion-dollar deals with less intensity than the conversation unfolding before him. But this wasn't a deal. There were no terms, no leverage, no escape routes. This was something real. And for the first time in his life, Marcus felt unprepared. He reached for his glass of scotch, took a slow sip, and then set it down. His mind was racing with thoughts of all the years lost, of the father he had never been, of the relationship he had no idea how to build. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. His eyes met theirs. Would you stay for dinner? Caleb raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing on his lips. You cook. Marcus chuckled, an unfamiliar sound that felt foreign yet strangely welcome. I have a chef. Adrian grinned. Figures. Marcus pulled out his phone and, for the first time, canceled an evening meeting that would have otherwise consumed his night. Tonight, business could wait. Tonight was about something more important. As he made the call, Adrian and Caleb exchanged glances, Maybe, just maybe, Marcus Davidson wasn't just a CEO. Maybe he was a father too. Breaking the walls. Marcus Davidson had spent his entire life building wealth, building power, building an empire that would outlive him. But as he sat at the long, polished dining table across from his sons, he realized he had never built the one thing that truly mattered: a family. The dinner table was set with elegance, a pristine white tablecloth draped over the mahogany surface, the soft glow of chandeliers above reflecting off crystal wine glasses. The chef had prepared a flawless gourmet meal: seared filet mignon, roasted vegetables, and a delicate red wine reduction. Yet, despite the grandeur of the meal, an invisible barrier lingered between them. Adrian and Caleb sat across from him, forks poised, hesitant. Marcus himself had no appetite. How did a man accustomed to boardroom battles navigate something as fragile as a father-son relationship? Adrian was the first to break the silence, cutting into his steak. "I have to admit, this is a step up from the takeout we usually get." Caleb smirked. "Yeah, Mom used to cook, but when things got busy, it was all about quick meals. She didn't have time for fancy dinners." Marcus felt a pang of guilt. Evelyn had done everything alone. He had never been there to see her struggle, never been there to share the weight. "What was she like?" Marcus asked, his voice quieter than before. The brothers exchanged a glance. Adrian set his fork down. "She was strong, fierce, even. She never let anything break her. She was kind too," Caleb added. "But she didn't take nonsense from anyone. She worked hard, built a life for us, and never once made us feel like we were missing anything." Marcus exhaled slowly, except for a father. Caleb hesitated before nodding. "Yeah." Adrian leaned forward. "We didn't come here to guilt you, Marcus." Marcus flinched at the sound of his name. Not Dad, not father, just Marcus. It was fair. He hadn't earned the title. Adrian continued, "We came because we needed to see you. We needed to understand why you left, why you never looked back." Marcus looked at his hands, the weight of decades pressing down on him. "I thought I was doing the right thing." Caleb scoffed. "By leaving?" Marcus met his gaze, unwavering. "By making sure you never lived in my shadow." The room fell silent. Adrian leaned back, studying him. "Explain." Marcus inhaled sharply. "I grew up with nothing. My father, your grandfather, was a failed businessman who lost everything. I watched my mother work herself to the bone, trying to keep food on the table. I swore I would never be like him, that I would never let my family suffer like that." He swirled the wine in his glass, staring at the deep red liquid as if searching for answers. "When I met your mother, I was still a nobody. But I had ambition. I knew I was going to build something huge. And I knew that life, this life, wasn't meant for family. I couldn't be the man she needed, and be the man I had to become." Caleb frowned. "So instead of trying, you just left." Marcus sighed. "I thought I was sparing her, sparing you. I thought if I disappeared, you'd never have to grow up in the chaos of my world." Adrian's expression hardened. "You decided that for us." Marcus met his son's piercing gaze. "Yes, and I see now that it was a mistake." The words felt foreign on his tongue. Marcus Davidson did not do regret. He did not second-guess his choices, yet here, before his sons, he was stripped of his armor. Caleb ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "Do you even want a relationship with us, or is this just a way to clear your conscience?" The question hit like a dagger. Marcus could have given a rehearsed, polished answer, the kind he delivered to investors, to board members. But this wasn't business. This was real. "I don't know how to be a father," he admitted, his voice raw. "But I want to learn." Adrian and Caleb exchanged another look. A silent conversation passed between them. Then, Adrian leaned forward. "We don't need you to be perfect. We just need you to try." Marcus nodded, his throat tight. Then let's start there. For the first time in years, the walls he had built around himself began to crack. And through the fractures, something unfamiliar began to seep in, something he had spent his entire life avoiding. Connection. Family. Hope. A father reborn. Marcus Davidson had spent his entire life believing that power and wealth could shield him from pain, that keeping his heart guarded would prevent loss, that staying distant was the best way to control the chaos life inevitably brought. But tonight, as he stood in the vast living room of his Newport Beach villa, watching his two sons across from him, he realized how wrong he had been. For years, he had convinced himself that he had no room for family, no space for love or connection. Yet here they were, Adrian and Caleb, standing in his home, forcing him to confront the ghosts of his past. And for the first time, Marcus wasn't running. A step into the unknown. The dinner had ended, but the conversation had only begun. The three of them now sat on the villa's grand terrace, overlooking the darkened Pacific Ocean. The waves crashed below, rhythmic and ceaseless. "I know an apology isn't enough," Marcus said finally, breaking the quiet. "I can't rewrite the past. I can't give you back the years I wasn't there." Caleb leaned back, crossing his arms. "No, you can't." Adrian, more composed, simply nodded. "But you can decide what happens next." Marcus exhaled slowly. It was a terrifying thought. He had spent decades making choices for others, employees, executives, entire industries. Yet this decision, the one that mattered most, left him feeling completely exposed. He had no experience being a father, but he had no experience being loved either. And maybe, just maybe, that was the real problem. Facing the past, a long silence stretched between them before Marcus finally spoke. "Would you want to see where I grew up?" Adrian and Caleb exchanged glances. "You mean like your childhood home?" Caleb asked, skeptical. Marcus nodded. "It's been abandoned for years. I never had a reason to go back." Adrian studied his father carefully, then gave a small nod. "Let's do it." Marcus had expected resistance. He had expected them to leave, to walk away from him as he had once walked away from them. Instead, they were saying yes, and suddenly there was no turning back. The journey home. The next morning, Marcus took them to a place he had spent a lifetime avoiding. A 2-hour drive inland led them to a forgotten neighborhood on the outskirts of Los Angeles. The houses were smaller here, worn by time and neglect. Sidewalks cracked under the weight of age. Faded graffiti lined the alley walls. And then they arrived. A small, run-down house with peeling paint and a rusted front gate. It looked as if it had been untouched since the day Marcus left. For a long moment, none of them spoke. "You lived here?" Caleb finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus nodded, his throat tight. This was home. Adrian ran a hand over the worn wooden fence. "It feels like a different world." Marcus gave a hollow laugh. It was. He pushed open the creaking gate and stepped inside. Dust coated every surface, but the memories were still fresh. The dim light filtering through the cracked blinds illuminated old, faded wallpaper. A single broken chair remained in the corner of the living room, the last piece of his childhood. Marcus walked through the space, each step heavier than the last. "My father used to sit there," he murmured, pointing at the chair. "Every night, he'd drink himself into a stupor. My mother would be in the kitchen, trying to make ends meet." Adrian and Caleb stood quietly, listening. Marcus turned to them. "I swore to myself that I'd never live like this, that I'd never let my children struggle the way I did." Caleb frowned. "But in trying to avoid this life, you left us with no life with you at all." Marcus looked away, guilt clawing at his chest. "I thought I was protecting you." Adrian sighed. "We didn't need protection. We needed a father." The truth of their words hit him harder than he expected. Marcus had built his entire identity around running. From his past, from his pain, from anything that made him vulnerable. But now, for the first time, he wasn't running. He was facing it, breaking the chains. As they left the house, Marcus paused at the threshold, looking back one last time. He had spent years trying to erase this place from his memory. But now, standing here with his sons, he saw it for what it truly was. Not a prison, not a curse, just the beginning. Marcus turned to them. "I can't change the past. But if you'll let me, I'd like to be part of your future." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "What does that mean, exactly?" Marcus met his gaze, determined. "It means I want to get to know you. It means I want you to get to know me. No business, no boardrooms, just us." Adrian studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Then let's start now." For the first time in his life, Marcus wasn't making a business deal. He wasn't closing a negotiation. He was opening his heart, and as he walked away from the house with his sons beside him, he knew this was only the beginning.